Good evening. On behalf of the Soeterbeeck Programma, Centrum voor Ethiek of the Radboud University and the publishing house Nieuw Amsterdam, I'd like to welcome you to this very special evening. My name is Kees Leijenhorst. I have the honor of introducing to you Andrew Solomon, who was already present here virtually, but he's present really here as well. Andrew has published on a very wide variety of subjects about Russia. He's written a very, very highly acclaimed book on depression, the Noonday Demon, which almost won the Pulitzer Prize, but which was also listed by the London Times as among the decades 100 most important and most remarkable books. But he's here tonight for yet another book. The book that's out now in Dutch, translated as Ver van de boom, Far from the Tree. And he's going to talk about this book tonight. The subject of the book, I think, has been made clear by the small movie we've just seen. You're expecting a child, and consciously or unconsciously, you're expecting a perfect child. You're expecting a beautiful child. You're expecting your child, your offspring. And then something is wrong with it. It's different. It's different from your expectations. Maybe autistic, maybe deaf, may have all kinds of severe handicaps, may go criminal, maybe schizophrenic. So the child is different. It's different in all kinds of respects, different from your expectations, different from the norms set by our society, and also from your own norms. What does this do to you as a parent? What does this mean for your identity? What does it mean for the child's identity? This is a book based on hundreds of interviews with parents that have children that are different. It raises all kinds of questions, namely the question of identity. What is different? Anyway, is there something like a normal child, and what does it mean to be normal? But I personally think, above all, and I think it's already clear from the few interviews, the bits and pieces of interviews we just saw, it's also very much a book about love. It's a book about love that is against all odds. It's a book about loving despite all kinds of hardship. It's a book about losing love and losing trust also, very much. And it's a very moving book, and at the same time a book that makes you think. Well, thinking is what we're here for at the Soeterbeeck Programma. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Andrew Solomon, who's going to speak to us. Andrew? Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks to all of you so much for coming out on this chilly evening to come here and hear a bit about this. It's lovely, lovely to be here. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That was in Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. It was the accepted view of the mainstream. And now we live in an era in which gay marriage is gradually becoming legal in many countries around the globe, and has received endorsement even in the United States. And I set out to write my book determined to figure out how this shift had taken place. How did something that had been universally judged an illness become instead an identity? When I was perhaps 6 years old, I went with my mother and my brother to buy shoes. And at the end of getting our shoes fitted, the salesman said to us that we could each have a balloon to take home. And my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said that she thought I'd really rather have a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink balloon. And she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. The fact that my favorite color now is blue, but I'm still gay, gives you some evidence, I think, of a mother's influence and its limits. While I was growing up, my mother used to say all the time, the love you have for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. And when I was very little, I took that as a great compliment. It meant that bringing up my brother and me was the chief joy of her life. And as I got to be older, it made me uneasy because I thought, but I think I'm gay. And if I'm gay, I probably won't be able to have children. And so I was anxious when she said it. And then when I finally came out in my early 20s and she continued to say it, it made me very angry. And I said, you know that's not the path that I'm on, and I want you to stop saying that. But she never did. The love you have for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. About 20 years ago, my editors at the New York Times Magazine assigned me to write an article about deaf culture. And I was taken aback by the assignment because I was mostly doing foreign reporting at the time. And my editor said, this is a foreign culture within our own. And I had no idea that deafness could be imagined as a culture. I thought it was a disability. How sad for those people who couldn't hear. What a tragedy, what a devastation. And I was very bewildered by the assignment. And then I went out into the deaf world, and I began to meet deaf people. And I went to deaf clubs, and I went to deaf theater. I even went to the Miss Deaf America contest in Nashville, Tennessee, where people complained about that slurry Southern signing. And while I was there, I came to understand that deafness is a culture. It's a culture organized around the shared use of sign language, and it's quite a rich and quite a vital culture. And when I was at the meeting of the National Association for the Deaf, I found myself wishing some of the time that I were deaf. Not that I genuinely wanted to give up my hearing, but I saw the warm embraces people gave to one another, the way that they rushed to say hello. I saw the conversations as all of these hands moved up in the air, and I felt left out for not being part of it. And I understood why, for the people who were part of it, it was a precious and a beautiful world. And then I discovered that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, that those parents, by and large, attempt to get them to conform to the mainstream by teaching them lip reading at that time, lip reading and oral speech, and that many of those children discover deaf culture only in adolescence, when they begin to sign and enter a signing world. And when they find deaf culture, it is a glorious liberation for them. And the families then have to reconcile with who the children have turned out to be. And as I listened to that story over and over again, I thought about the experience of gay people who are mostly born to straight parents, who mostly try in their various ways to get them to function in what they think of as the real or the normal world, and who have to have that great moment of liberation that comes partway through. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And I started listening to the concerns of this mother, who said, do I bring my child up to understand that she's just like everyone else, only she's short? Or do I try to help her to become someone with a strong sense of dwarf identity? Do I join the little people of America? Do I somehow instill in her a notion that her difference is this glorious thing in her? And as she narrated her bewilderment, I thought, here it is again. Here it is again, a family in which there is the understanding of the family as somehow normal, and a child who's somehow exceptional, and the family doesn't know what they ought to do to make the situation work. And it was at that point that I began to hatch the idea, which is central to what I've written, and which Case mentioned earlier, but that there are both vertical identities, identities that are passed down from parent to child, and horizontal identities, identities that are learned from a peer group. So one's ethnicity, for example, is a vertical identity. It's something children have in common with their parents. One's nationality, usually one's language, frequently one's religion. These are all things parents and children have in common, and there are arguments to be made that some of those identities are difficult identities, but no one is doing research on how to cure them. You can say that it's still more difficult in most Western countries to be black than to be white. But no one is trying to figure out how to make sure the next generation of children born to black parents come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. And yet at the same time, when you get to these horizontal identities, like deafness, like being gay, like dwarfism, like the many others that I explored in my book, these identities people have tried to cure since the beginning of time, because parents look at their children and find in their children some sort of aberrance. And I thought that's a really crucial distinction to make. In order for those children to achieve any level of sense of self-worth, they really require two things of their parents. They require love and they require acceptance. And often the two things get conflated. When my parents were initially somewhat uncomfortable with the fact that I was gay, I experienced it as a deficit in their love. But over time I realized that it wasn't a deficit in their love. It was only a lag in their acceptance. And I discovered as I did this research that while parents should ideally love their children from very soon after they're born and should act lovingly toward them, even if the feeling of love takes a little while fully to come in, that love is different from acceptance, and that accepting your child as the separate being that he or she is a process. It's always a process. It takes time. It always takes time. All things considered, it didn't take my parents that much time. And that acceptance is something that has to be the ultimate goal of love, but is not the same as love. And for the people who are directly affected by the conditions I was writing about, those conditions being deafness, dwarfism, Down syndrome, autism, schizophrenia, multiple severe disabilities, prodigies who are also quite overwhelming to their parents, children conceived in rape, children who commit crimes, and people who are transgender. In looking across all those categories, people need to achieve self-acceptance, they need to achieve family acceptance, and they need social acceptance. And they need all of those things to come together, and each enables the other. Someone with good self-acceptance can have a strong effect on making his family accept him and can change the society. But in an accepting society, it's much easier for parents to accept a child who is essentially different. I'll tell you a few of the stories from the book. And I'm going to start with the story of Clinton Brown, who was the dwarf you just saw in the video, more of whom you'll see in a little bit. So Clinton, as he said, when he was born, the doctor said that he was never going to have any meaningful relationship with his parents, and his mother was in fact advised to leave him in the hospital to die. And she insisted instead on taking him home. She didn't have vast resources, either educational or financial, and it was before the era of the internet. But she somehow did a lot of research and found the doctor who was best suited to treat someone with dystrophic dwarfism, which is the condition he has. And she made her way down to Johns Hopkins Hospital, and she enrolled him in their surgical program. And as he said, he had 30 major surgical procedures in the course of his childhood in which he learned to walk. And as you could see in the video, he has also learned to talk. In fact, while he was in the hospital having all of those surgeries, there was nothing else very much for him to do, and so he focused in on his schoolwork, and he achieved at a level that had previously been unimaginable in his family, and he was the first member of his family to go to university. And he went to university not very far from where his parents live, and he had a specially fitted car that he could drive, despite his diminutive stature. And his mother called me one day and said, "I was coming home from shopping today, and I went past a bar, and there was Clinton's car parked outside a bar." She said, and I thought to myself, he's 3 feet tall, they're 6 feet tall, 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. She said, I wanted to go in there and interrupt, but I knew I couldn't do that. So I just drove home and left him 11 messages on his cell phone. She said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry would be that he would go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so thrilled to have that problem. And I said to her, what do you think you did that allowed him to emerge as such a charming, delightful, accomplished person? Since I wrote the book, he's gotten engaged to be married. He's an amazing, amazing guy in many ways. But I said to his mother then, I said, what did you do that allowed him to emerge as this after that dire prognosis when he was born? And his mother said, what did we do? We loved him, that's all. Clinton just always had that light in him, and we were lucky enough to be the first to see it there. I'm going to quote from another magazine from the 1960s, once more an American magazine. This was considered quite a liberal magazine at the time, still is, the Atlantic Monthly. In an essay by a medical ethicist came the statement, children with Down syndrome need not be, sorry, let me get it. There is no reason to feel guilty about putting away a child with Down syndrome, whether he is put away in the sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. It mostly seems shocking at this point to hear those words, a Downs is not a person, and to hear the suggestions that are encoded in that writing. And I think that there's been a lot of ink given to the shifting landscape for gay rights here in the Netherlands, in the United States, in many other countries. It's in the headlines a great deal, and the changes are dramatic and are much to be celebrated. But I think we've had a general social shift in our acceptance of difference, which has received much less coverage, but which is at least equally profound. People with Down syndrome now live more than twice as long as they did at the time that that was written. They have accomplishments that were previously unimaginable. People are actors, people are writers, people are living semi-independently. It's extraordinary how much of a shift there's been. One woman I know who's worked with people with Down syndrome for many years described going out to lunch with the man with Down syndrome who appears as an actor on the television program Glee. And she said people were coming over to get his autograph. She said he was a celebrity first and a person with a disability second. And it was astonishing to her that she could ever have lived to see such a thing happen. One of the families I got to be quite friendly with while I was working on the issue of Down syndrome, Tom and Karen Robards, when their child was born, were very shocked, had no expectation that there could be anything that would go wrong. And as he began to grow up, they felt the educational opportunities available were not so great. And so with a few other parents, they started a single classroom in which they could get a teacher to come in and teach their children. That was nearly 30 years ago, and that classroom has grown into something called the Cook Center, which has educated vast numbers of people with intellectual disabilities of various kinds. And it's become really the life's work of the Robards family. And I said to them, do you regret having a child with Down syndrome? Do you regret that your son has it? This has been so central. You've had such a big effect here. Your son has done so well in so many ways. I said, do you wish that you could make it go away? And his father, Tom Robard, said, I wish for David that I could make it go away, because for David it's a very difficult way to be in the world, and I would like to give him an easier life. But I think if we lost everyone who has Down syndrome from the society, that would be a really sad and grievous loss. He said, so my feeling is that my personal wish and my social wish are in some form of opposition. And Karen Robard said, well, I'm with Tom. If I could make it go away, I would do so for David, because I would like to give David an easier life. But speaking for myself, while I would never have believed when he was born that I could come to such a point, speaking for myself, I have. For David, I'd make it go away in an instant. But for me, it's made my life so much more purposeful, so much more engaged, so much more interesting, has so deepened my humanity, that speaking for myself, I wouldn't exchange these experiences for anything in the world. I'm struck by how much social progress there's been toward the acceptance of the various conditions that I've just been describing. But that social progress happens to coincide with a great deal of scientific progress. The scientific progress has involved finding cures and treatments or means of avoiding these situations. So the cochlear implant is a device that can be surgically implanted in the brain, connected to a transmitter, and allows sound information to be relayed to the brain bypassing the structures of the ear. It's given to an increasingly large number of children born deaf, many of whom grow up with functional language and are effectively almost hearing. For dwarfs, there's a new compound called BMN 111. It blocks the action of the gene that causes achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism. In mice and rats who have achondroplasia, when they're given this drug, they grow to full size. Testing in humans is now underway. And for Down syndrome, there are blood tests, some of them very recently developed, that allow parents to find out earlier and earlier and earlier in their pregnancies whether their child has a genetic anomaly, making it easier and easier to terminate those pregnancies if they wish to do so. Now, I'm a believer in social progress, and I'm also a believer in scientific progress. But I think sometimes they're perilously unaware of each other. And sometimes when I see these identity movements gaining strength at the exact same time that science is coming forward with cures, it reminds me of those scenes at the end of Grand Opera when the hero realizes he loves the heroine at the exact moment that she dies on the sofa. And I think that it's a very curious moment to live in, and that there are a lot of ethical choices and decisions that are attached to that. The question of whether people should be cured altogether is an open question. So Jim Sinclair, who's an autism activist, wrote a very powerful essay called Don't Mourn for Us. And in it he said, when parents say, I wish my child did not have autism, what they're really saying is, I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child instead. Read that again. This is what we hear when you mourn over our existence. This is what we know when you pray for a cure, that your fondest wish is that someday we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. It's a very extreme way of phrasing it, but it was consonant with much of what I experienced, which was that people who have a given condition and have come to understand and experience it as an identity don't particularly want it to be cured. The Robards may want to cure their son's Down syndrome, but there are lots of people who have other conditions who described to me how much meaning they found in the conditions themselves. And insofar as they struggled with their conditions, there were two elements to the struggle, one of which may be the inherent difficulties of the situation. Clinton Brown needed to have surgery 30 times in his childhood. No one would wish that on their own child. But the other piece of it is social prejudice. When I went out to lunch with Clinton Brown at a restaurant in New York, everyone turned and stared as we walked in, and you knew they were going to go home and say, there was a guy at the restaurant today, he was less than 3 feet tall, less than a meter tall, he was this tiny little guy. You could feel that it was an occasion in their lives, and that's exhausting. It's exhausting to live with that kind of attention. So how do you separate out those two elements and those two issues? Of the many families I interviewed, in some ways, the most poignant conversation of all was with Tom and Sue Klebold, who were the parents of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine Massacre, which when it occurred in 1999 was the worst school shooting in history. They killed 12 students and 1 teacher before turning their guns on themselves. It was a tragedy of almost unimaginable proportion and completely terrifying to their school. And I spent years persuading his parents that they should talk to me about what their experience was. And they resisted it for years. And finally, when they agreed to do it, they were so full of their story that they couldn't stop telling it. And the first weekend I spent with them, the first of many, we recorded more than 20 hours of interviews. And at the end of this exhausting weekend, we were all sitting Sunday night in the kitchen. Sue was making dinner for us. And I said to them, look, if Dylan were here now, is there anything you'd want to ask him? And his father said, there sure is. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother sort of looked at the floor, and she thought for a minute. And then she looked back up and said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And I thought that was such an extraordinary moment to have reached. I had gone out to see the Klebolds thinking, okay, but this kind of crime comes from someplace, and if I get to know these people, I'll understand where it came from. And I've gotten to know them incredibly well. I had an email from Sue just this afternoon. My feeling is that I understand it less than I did before I met them. I happen to be quite fond of my own parents, but I would have been happy to grow up in that household and with those parents. And I say that with real conviction. And a few years later, Sue and I were having dinner one night. We'd had many, many evenings together, all of us. Sue and I were having dinner in Denver, and she said to me, you know, when it first happened, I used to wish I had never gone to Ohio State. I wouldn't have met Tom. We wouldn't have married. These children wouldn't have existed, and this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. But over time, she said, I've come to feel that I love the children I had so much that I wouldn't want to imagine a life without them, even at the price of this pain. When I say that, I'm talking about my own pain, of course, and not the pain of other people. But life is full of suffering, and this is mine. So while I recognize that it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, I've decided that it would not have been better for me. I wondered about this a lot, about how many of these parents said that they cherished the children they had and that they wouldn't have them any other way, by the ways in which Cheryl Brown described Clinton as being this remarkable child who was the light of her life, by the way that the Robards talked about the glory of their experience with their child, by the ways in which the Klebold's even talked about their deep love for their son. And I thought, but surely all of these people would have preferred other children. They would have preferred children without these problems. Now, it should be observed that they didn't have the option of having other children, and they were therefore always holding an actual life against a hypothetical life, and in that comparison, an actual life has always got brighter colors. But beyond that, I thought everyone who has children who are flawed in some ways. And if some glorious angel were suddenly to come down through the ceiling and say, I can take away the children you have and give you other children who are more attractive and more intelligent and have better manners, people would be horrified by that, and they would pray away that atrocious spectacle, not leap at the occasion. There's a sociologist who said, we not only care for our children because we love them, but also love our children because we care for them. And I think that's true. I think the process of taking care of someone very vulnerable is a deeply bonding experience. So while there are parents who are abusive, or parents who are neglectful, or people who weren't cut out for parenting, by and large, by the time you've taken care of someone for a decade, you've grown a deep attachment and you don't want to turn that person in for someone else. And the whole attitude was summed up for me by Sarah Haddon, who had 2 children with very, very severe disabilities who couldn't walk or talk, one of whom died tragically through caregiver neglect. And when her child was having his internment of his ashes a year after he died, she said at the graveside, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed, once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved." Each of the differences I was looking at, taken individually, is quite isolating. There are only so many families of people with schizophrenia. There are only so many families of people with Down syndrome. There are only so many families of people who are transgender. But if you consider that this process of dealing with a child who presents a challenge which was not entirely welcome when it surfaced and which you have to negotiate your way around, then you discover that all of these families have things in common. And in fact, when I wrote the book, lots of the people I was interviewing objected to being in with the people in the other chapters. The deaf people said, okay, but we are a linguistic subculture. How can you associate us with people who can't even walk or talk? And the autistic people said, we're so much smarter than the people with Down syndrome. And the prodigy said, what are we doing in this book at all? And as I went through that whole experience, there was the sense that for each of them, their own difference had become normal and the other differences remained abnormal. But if they could see how much there was in common among their families and these other families, how much scope there was for normality to expand itself, then suddenly they find themselves in a rich company. And I had a very gratifying experience, which is that I had a party when the book came out, and I invited as many of the people as I could who were in it to come to the party. And I got a message about 2 weeks later from one of the people, and it was a dwarf and a woman with schizophrenia and the father of a child with autism, and they had all gone out to dinner together because they'd all found they had so much in common, partly through having dealt with my interview style, but also in their sort of larger identity. So I really think that in a way the revelation of the book is that difference unites us. Now, I decided to have children while I was in the process of writing this book. And people kept saying to me, how could you possibly have decided to have children in the middle of a book about everything that can go wrong? And I had to say over and over again, but it's not really a book about everything that can go wrong. It's a book about how much love and joy there can be, even when everything seems to be going wrong. So I will give you the sort of rough description of how the family works. My husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis, Oliver and Lucy. They call us Daddy and Papa, but we aren't legally their parents. One of my closest friends from university wanted to have a child after she got divorced, and so she and I have a daughter, and mother and daughter live in Texas, and I am legally the father of that daughter and very much involved in her life. And then my husband, John, and I decided that we wanted to have a child who would live with us full time, and so we had George, who I'm the biological father. We had an egg donor, and our surrogate was Laura, the lesbian mother of Oliver and Lucy. So the shorthand is 5 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And there are people who seem to think that the existence of families such as mine somehow undermines families such as theirs. And I don't accept those subtractive models of love, only additive ones. And I believe that in the same way that we need to have a diversity of species to sustain the planet, so we need to have a diversity of affection to sustain the ecosphere of kindness. When George was born, our son, it was a joyful day, as such days are, anxious but joyful. And then the next morning, the pediatrician came in and said that she was concerned. She said George was not extending his legs as he should have been, and that that could reflect neurological damage. She said insofar as he was extending them, he was doing so asymmetrically, which could reflect a mass in his brain. She said he had a very large head and he should be tested for hydrocephalus. And I felt the whole center of my being pouring out onto the floor. And I thought, here I have been writing a book all about how much meaning people find in the experience of having children with differences and disabilities, and I fervently don't want to join their number. And we went off for endless testing that day. We went for an MRI, we went for a CAT scan, we went for other x-rays, we went for an arterial blood draw, and as we took this tiny, vulnerable child less than 24 hours off and rolled him down one corridor after the next to one of these tests after the next, I felt this sense of despair. But I knew that sense of despair was about the idea of illness. And I knew that if he had any of the things we were testing him for, they would become his identity in many ways. And I understood at that moment that if it became his identity, it was going to become my identity too. And I thought to myself, the love for your children is unlike any other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. At the end of 5 hours of this, the pediatrician called us in and told us that actually George was fine, the tests were clear, and he was now extending his legs perfectly. And I asked her what she thought might have been going on in the morning, and she said he had probably had a cramp. I'm pleased to say, though, it was the sort of launching, really, of a great love, and that sense of that threat, I think, in some way nuanced. It forced us into a very early intensity that I think has served us very well. In any case, children had ensnared me, I think, the moment I connected fatherhood with loss. But I doubt that I would have noticed that if I hadn't been working on the research for Far From the Tree. While I was doing it, I had encountered so much strange love, and it was easy to fall into its bewitching patterns. Working on the book, I had often thought that the parents I was interviewing were crazy, tying themselves to a lifetime's journey with these miserable children, trying to breed identity out of despair. And I was startled to realize that day that my research had built me a plank and that I was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you.
I am looked at and stared at and the center of attention everywhere I go. Everywhere I go. By everybody that's around me. So I'm constantly being judged. I'm constantly being looked at, good, bad, or indifferent. It's something that you need to learn how to either not pay attention to and enjoy it, or deal with it, because it's going to be part of your life forever. It's like being a celebrity, but without the fame and the money. When I was born, my mom refused to see me for 3 days. Not refused, but didn't see me for any reasons varying from I was in an incubator to she was scared. The doctors gave her a paragraph in a medical dictionary that described what I was from a medical standpoint, a paragraph. That was all they had. Said he would never amount to anything, his mental capacity would be little to none, and you should probably give him up and think about adoption. And there were people for and against it in the family, and it was supposedly a big family discussion. Mom saw me after 3 days. My dad saw me right away. And the funny side of it is my dad said, he looks cute. He's just got a big head and little arms. The funny thing is I still look that way, but in any event, my mom held me, and she's been in love with her son ever since. You know, it's a mother's love for her son. Well, diastrophic dwarfism is a rare type of dwarfism. There's about 300 to 400 of us in the world, and it affects our cartilage, and so we have joints and bones that are twisted and distorted. So our life is marred with a lot of surgeries. Myself, I've had 30. Once you start having your own thoughts, like around 5, 6, or 7 years old, and you start wanting to flourish, and you can't, that's when it becomes the most frustrating. The way I coped with it was I would always find something that would make me happy, whether it was in my thoughts, or whether it was playing video games, or watching sports, or watching movies. I went to this convention, and I walked into the hotel, and there were hundreds of other little people walked in, and I said to myself, wow, so this is what it's like to be normal. I'm going to go wild. So I made every friend that you could in the book. I was myself in kind of my skin for the first time in my life. I felt like I could be the man. And I ended up becoming a leader in the community because I guess that's naturally who I am. You know, big, tall, fat, or small. You are who you are. And so I was able to really connect with that side of me in this group. And I think it's helped me in a lot of other parts of my life, my career and other areas. So it's been great. I'm a finance guy for a cable company in Long Island. After hours, I have a wonderful family, a mom and a dad, which you all have met or will meet in the book, and my girlfriend, Sophia, who I've been dating for 2.5 years, and who I'm madly in love with. I used what God gave me. God didn't give me, legs to run. He didn't give me, arms to play football with. He gave me a brain, and he gave me a heart, and I try to use both of those things to the full.
I'd like to introduce to you Professor Jan Brands. He's a professor of philosophy behavioral sciences here at Radboud University. Jan, a brief comment to this video clip.
Yeah,
start the discussion.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to talk to you about this. There are a couple of themes in the book that relate to the themes I'm working on, and one of them is identity. And my first question actually is about the distinction you make between horizontal and vertical identity. And in some sense, these terms sound as if they are rather fixed and rather stable, and I have some worries there. So this is just to start the conversation going. The subtitle of the book, at least the American version, is In Search of Your Identity. And search sounds as if there's an identity somewhere out there that you have to find if you are looking well enough. And if you are a dwarf, you will have some problems. But when you get to this convention where all these other dwarfs are, you suddenly find something that is horizontal. And I'm wondering whether what it is a fixed identity that you then find, or whether it's a kind of language in which you can start to relate to yourself in a way that makes sense of your experiences. And I'm wondering whether vertical and horizontal identity connect well with the fact that an identity is something that you work all your life towards or on.
Well, there are various pieces. It's a terrific question, and there are various pieces to the answer. In the first place, everyone has many identities. I mean, Clinton has an identity as an American. He has an identity as, I believe he's a Catholic. He has an identity as a person who is now in his 30s. He has all kinds of other identities that I won't go into. He has an identity that's come out of his relationship with Sophia and being madly in love with her, and how that's changed his understanding of himself. He has an identity as a dwarf. He has an identity specifically as a diastrophic dwarf. There are many components to his identity. So it's not as though you have no identity and then you walk into the dwarf conference, LPA, and suddenly you have this identity and it's all sort of simple and clear. So that's the first thing to say. But the more interesting part of your question, I think, is about the extent to which identity is something that's discovered and the extent to which it's something that's created. And my belief is that a lot of people said to me when I started doing this work, and indeed when I wrote about depression and when I did the other books that I've done, wrote about Soviet artists, all of the books were about people who managed to create an occasion of dignity out of an obvious threat and challenge. And as I worked on the material, I came to think it's not the case that everybody gets better by finding meaning, which was what I had always heard, as though meaning were sort of out there and clever people could see it and other people unfortunately didn't have the eyes to find it. It's actually about forging meaning. You set out to try to find some kind of meaning in your experience and you end up creating that meaning and creating that sense of purpose. So one of the mothers who I interviewed, who had 2 children, another mother with 2 children with very severe disabilities, said, people always give us these little sayings like, God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen. And I think that was true for the families as they established identity, and I think it's true for the people who have these conditions. You know, when I talked to the deaf people who said, but I would never want to give up being deaf because I've been part of this world, I thought to myself, yes, but you found this world and you developed all of these relationships. And when you reach adulthood, you have a life that's structured around the world that you have found and occupied. So I go back to myself, egomaniacally, but I think to myself, you know, would I have wanted to be straight? Well, I would have had an easier childhood if I were straight, and at the time, I certainly would have chosen that. Now, to be straight would mean to give up my husband and my children and the family I have and the life that I have, and it seems unimaginable, and I would be terribly upset to have all of that taken away from me. Is the identity that I have a fixed identity? Now I've worked it out and it's all perfectly fine and I never have to think about it again? No, it goes on all the time. We've just gone through this idiotic process in America of trying to find the right school for our son. You have to apply to lots of schools and go on interviews and do all of this other nonsense. But I spent the whole time thinking, okay, but how does where he goes to school end up defining him? What kind of a school will suit him? What kind of school will suit the reality that he comes from a gay family and should be at a school where that isn't seen as too exceptional? How will the kind of school he goes to and the kind of identity he develops require me to shift and change my own identity on an ongoing basis? So it's a nuanced, layered process.
Yeah, I see that. So identity is something that you make and find, and those mingle together, and they sometimes they go apart for a while, and then some changes happen. And okay,
but I was wondering how does this relate to another one of the key terms, the key concepts in your whole book is also about acceptance. Now, acceptance can be read as something you accept something as given, and it's a kind of you rest in that, so to speak. Forging your identity is a very active process. You make your identity in a certain way. So we agree that it's not just finding, it's also making. How does this relate to accepting? For instance, accepting the fact that you're gay is, to me, sounds different than styling myself into a gay person, making my own identity. So how does acceptance come into this story you just told?
Well, I think acceptance is a piece of forging, and I think acceptance frequently requires a great leap of the imagination. I mean, right. Clinton Brown's mother found out what he had, and she didn't see him for several days, and she thought about giving him up for adoption or about leaving him to die quietly at the hospital. She said, leaving him to die at the hospital. He said, adoption. I mean, there's already an interesting tension between those two narratives. But she considered all of those things, and then she decided this was her child, and she was going to do her best. And she said, if it turned out to be horrible, and we had to let him go later on, we would let him go later on, but I had to put my best effort into it. So I wouldn't say that her arriving at acceptance was a passive process. I would say it was a very active process, and that she sought to try to achieve that acceptance. Having said that, I think one's experience of one's identity is always filtered partly through a process of self-recognition and self-acceptance, which again I don't think is passive, but which I think contains certain elements of the inevitability, you know, if you have dystrophic dwarfism, you have to try to accept yourself as someone with dystrophic dwarfism, and that's an internal process. There's also a component of identity which is an external process. As he said, everyone stares at him, everyone pays attention to him, he's always the center of attention. How do you negotiate that relationship with the world? And in some ways, I feel like it's when you negotiate with the world that you have to be somewhat passive. There is nothing Clinton Brown can do that will cause him not to be the center of attention every place he goes, whenever he goes there. I described going out to lunch with him. That's going to be the case. He has to arrive at an acceptance of that fact, and he has to find a way to make a worthwhile life around it because it's not changeable. And I think when we look at the question of acceptance, that one of the central issues is that everyone has to decide about themselves and they have to decide about their children. What are the aspects of myself or my child which are changeable and which I can change to make a better and easier life? And what are the aspects of myself or my child that are unchangeable and that I need to learn to accept or even to celebrate? And there are some things that you obviously just have to accept, and there are some things you obviously want to change, and there's a very gray area in the middle where you don't know which way you want to go.
I see. And in this, so this gray middle area is where you have to work and try to articulate what belongs to you and what you can reconcile and what not. In what sense did you think that this kind of struggle that everybody, and even just ordinary, quite normal people have to struggle to appropriate their own identity, in what sense is the distinction between the horizontal bit and the vertical bit helping you to get a theoretical better grip on what this struggle is like?
I think it's an essential question because I think how one's identity is formed in early childhood determines a great deal about the whole rest of one's life. And I think if you're a little child and you grow up and your parents say, we live in a country where there's a lot of prejudice against people who are Islamic, for example. But we are Islamic, and it's a wonderful thing to be, and we have access to this whole rich culture and tradition, and you are fortunate to be part of that. That's going to form your sense of self-identity. Now, you may go to school and get teased by children who are non-Muslims. You may go out into the world and experience prejudice of one kind or another. There may be associations people make with your condition, but you have this basic background thing of having been told from the time you were little, we're terrific the way we are. And when you think about what does it mean to be Islamic, you look at your parents and you think, look what lives they've had as people who are Islamic. If you are experiencing a condition such as dystrophic dwarfism, your parents don't have dystrophic dwarfism. They can empathize at one level, but they can't fully understand what it's like to be you. They don't fully understand how it feels. They don't fully understand that experience of people staring all the time. And in many of the cases...
But probably they can, because if your child is a dwarf, probably you're the one who's also looked at all the time. So this may be not a bit that works, but I can see. So what you are saying is that the vertical bits that you share with your parents allow you to become more empowered with your own identity, and the horizontal bits make it difficult, make it more a struggle of your own, in which your parents cannot help you a lot.
Exactly, in which your parents cannot help you, and in which in many instances your parents, often with very good intentions, actually make things worse. They actually are saying to you, I know you're deaf, but if you just do more work with this audiologist, you may be able to pronounce enough words to get by. And as one of the people I interviewed said, you know, we spend all of this time with the audiologist learning to say, she said, we were supposed to study the French Revolution. What did we do? We spent 3 weeks with an audiologist learning to say guillotine. And mostly when we went to order a Coke at McDonald's, they couldn't tell what we were saying. And so your parents have given you this sense that you're damaged or you're broken, not because they hate you. They're trying to help you. They think it will make your life easier. But they've given you that negative sense, and that as a point of origin is very different from the experience of someone whose parents are saying you're just like us and how we are is a great way to be.
There's another bit to this discussion, because now we've shifted our attention to, let's say, the children, like the one we've just seen. What about accepting your own identity as a parent? You also have to accept the fact, in his case, for instance, Clinton's case, that his father and mother have to accept the fact that they are the parents of a dwarf, you know. And like all the parents in your book, there's also acceptance on the part of the parents and acceptance of a changed identity, at least an identity that's different from the one they were expecting when the child hadn't born yet. What about that? Is that different, and how does the vertical horizontal bit come in there?
Well, the parents do have a new identity. I mean, as I said in the end of my talk, I felt if George had any of these conditions, they would become in many ways my identity. And I thought that because I had seen all of these families in which the conditions do become the family's identity, the parent's identity, not only the child's identity. It's a slightly different identity, the identity of having a child who's different. And some people immediately see things in terms of their child, and some people see things in terms of themselves. I mean, I had the mother of another dwarf who I wrote about who said, I have to tell you, I hate it. She said, I go for a walk on the beach with my child, and I feel like I'm an object of attention and of fun, and I'm a quiet person, and I don't want everyone to be looking at me like that, and it's been a hideous struggle for me, and I wish it weren't the case. She loves her daughter. She's very attached to the young woman who her daughter now is, but she really hated that experience. So I think there's a huge identity shift for parents.
Yeah. Is that... but in case your child is just a bit like you, or rather like you, and so it seems as if you just share a lot of a vertical identity and not much of a horizontal differences, could it be that that creates a larger struggle later on in life for the child, because there's no way to... So identity is in part a matter of connecting, but also in part a matter of being different from having your own stance, being an individual. So if it's so vertical, everything, would it be difficult? Is this something that you...
I should start by saying that I think in looking at this question, I looked at the extreme cases of horizontal identity. But in fact, all parents have children who are different from them in some ways, and all intimate family relationships actually emerge in the negotiation around those forms of difference. So that's a very central aspect of the whole thing. That these, I mean, I sometimes say that in the same way that we test children's pajamas in an inferno to make sure they won't catch fire when our child reaches across the stove. So these families dealing with children who are dwarfs or autistic or with all of these extreme conditions really are a much more extreme reflection of what every family goes through. I have yet to meet any parent who has not occasionally looked at his or her child and thought, where on earth did you come from? So I think that is universal. But having said that, in response to the rest of what you were saying, I think the process of individuation is a very important process. I think that it should be a process which is triggered more by the child and less by the parent. But I think children who already have this sense of separateness often yearn to be more like their parents, and children who are very much like their parents yearn for the sense of separateness, that there's a kind of eternal wishing both to be merged with one's family, fully known, fully loved, fully experienced, and to separate and become oneself.
Right, and have you thought about, so sometimes extreme cases also create distortions of what the normal case is like. Could it also be that this kind of focusing on the extreme, very different horizontal identities somehow distorts what you think is your view of building or making up your own identity? So I mean, I don't know. So perhaps it's not a question to ask to you because you've looked at those extremes, but you can think about whether the extremes perhaps distort what's going on in the normal case, in the normal case.
Right.
Well, if there's one thing I've learned from this book, there is no normal case. Right.
I think there's no question that I was looking at extremes, and that extremes are not, I mean, the extreme of anything is not fully representative of the middle. But it seems to me there's a continuum. There's a continuum between the self-perception as normal and the self-perception as very profoundly aberrant, and most people are scattered along that spectrum. And I don't think you can say, when you look at the extreme case, distorts everything. I think it's a matter of degree. But a matter of degree can be significant. I mean, you look at the matter of degree there is between ordinary sadness and clinical depression, and you look at what the issues are within the family of someone. I mean, I had a letter from somebody which I particularly liked, who wrote to me and said, totally in earnest. He said, I wish you'd done a chapter, your book's very good, but I wish you'd done a chapter on people having my experience, which is that it's very difficult if you are a dog person and your child does not like dogs. And I thought, okay, but I mean, he experienced it as a great gap. I think that
it's a serious problem.
It is. It is. I am a dog person.
Yes,
so.
Me too. I can sympathize with you.
But I think in those, I think that the nature of the extremity comes from the emotional dynamic between the parent and child and not from the scope of the difference. Yeah. So I think that Clinton's parents were less distressed by his dwarfism than this man was by his child's lack of interest in dogs, and that therefore the sort of structures of intimacy are not determined by how extreme is the disability, but are determined by what is the dynamic and the personality of the parent and the child.
To close off this discussion on Clinton, I mean, it's an extraordinary case in the book, and it's also, you can also see it from the movie, the immense force with which indeed he forges his identity, the sense of humor he has, the extreme intelligence. What gets this guy going? It's just an incredible. I mean, you've got many cases in the book, and many sad cases, and many cases where things really do go terribly wrong, also with the parents. This is in a way a very successful case. What is it that distinguishes him from these other cases? Have you any sense of?
Well, I think he has enormous vitality. I mean, I think that's inherent in his personality. Yeah. I also will say that I arrived at my first dwarfism conference, and I was in a room with 500 people who didn't look like me. As Clinton said, you stuck out like a little person. And his parents were sort of sitting at the edge also because they'd come up with him. And his mother said to me, hi, you don't seem to know anyone. Who are you? And she introduced herself, and she was incredibly forthcoming. And it was right when I was starting the book, and I hadn't gone very far, and I hadn't really formulated the ideas very well, but I explained why I was there and said, she said, well, come and talk to us. And she said, do you want to go up right now? She was incredibly open and forthcoming and delightful. She's a delightful woman, and his father was delightful, and they didn't seem as though they had any sense of, inadequacy in the way that some of the parents I met did. And I think they passed that dynamism on to their son. But I think it took a lot of discipline and determination. I mean, Clinton's father said that on one occasion, when Clinton was recovering from one of those surgeries, and he was about 7 years old, he said he walked in and he was talking to Clinton, and he said, and Clinton just looked up at me and said, Dad, if I were average size, I'd be pretty wonderful, wouldn't I? And his father said he just broke down and began to cry and had to sort of quickly leave the room. But it's hard won, that position. It took him a long time to get there, and it took the family a long time to get there. And there was another story which is in the book, which I like very much, which was that when Clinton was about 10, I think, they were at a grocery store, and there were some little kids who kept pointing at him and making comments and so on. His father said, just ignore it. And then at a certain point, Clinton suddenly, he saw them going down one aisle, and he ran down the other aisle and said, boo! And they screamed and they ran away. And his father said, that wasn't very nice, Clinton. And he said, sometimes I just have to get it out of me. So.
Okay, let's go and watch another case.
Chris is in 11th grade, and pretty much on his own in high school. He has a mentor that helps him. No biting, Chris. All right, Chrissy, go to Mom. Let him walk off if you don't mind. Yeah. Go to Mom and I'll be off in a minute. Go to Mom. Chris probably had one of the worst diagnoses ever. Self-injurious, swollen intestines, poisons in his systems, neurological damage, mental retardation, severe autism, almost the Crohn's disease. Chris did not communicate. He didn't sit down. He didn't put on clothes. He wouldn't go outside. He ate the walls. He ate the table. He ate the rug. We couldn't eat in the home. We couldn't have lights on. We couldn't have the TV on. If I coughed, he would run downstairs and punch me. It was a 24-hour day job. Chris never slept. He never ate. He wore diapers, never spoke. And I was pretty much told to put him in an institution. It was obviously depressing, but so we went on this battle, to educate and to provide therapies. His mom went and studied everything she could get her hands on. She visited hospitals and schools and Johns Hopkins and Kennedy Krieger and Rutgers. And she set up a school in our home. Our home became a school. It was one of the first centers of ABA, which is Applied Behavioral Analysis. We set up intern programs with kids from Penn State and Franklin and Marshall, and we began teaching Chris. I thought to myself, if he's happy, if he stops hurting himself, you know, if I could hug him, that would be the greatest gift in life. And we continued against all odds, and he got better. I was telling him that you go to Elizabethtown, where do you go? Elizabethtown, Utah.
Elizabethtown High School.
Elizabethtown High School. And we're very proud of that, right? And we collect a lot of movies. We buy movies. Yeah, so I'm going to just talk about you because I love you. Can I have a kiss? The thing I've learned most over the years is to be a parent first. It changed my life completely. It put me in another direction. I was able to love unconditionally. And I never thought of him as this poor, broken human being that we need to cure. You know, he's not sick. You're trying to get me to go?
This is two
Amazing.
Wonderful people.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And there's an interesting, at least I think there's an interesting shift in the way he is talking about his own parenthood and about his parenting. So in the beginning, when Chris was just born, it seemed as if there was a tremendous burden that was on his shoulders and on his wife's shoulders, and they studied whatever they could, and they tried to provide therapy, and they started a battle, and it was 24 hours, and then they had to educate him, and it looked as if it is a kind of job that was so large for them, almost too large. And that's one picture of parenthood, where the parents think there's a child, and it's an incredible responsibility, and we have to make something of it. But then in the end, it seems as if in retrospect, parenthood is something very different, as if it's just about love, about hugging, about just being together, as just accepting the child as it is, without any need for efforts, for changing, for building, but for just letting be. And is this something that you've seen often in these parents, that in retrospect it seems so different than in anticipation?
I've seen often in parents, even of children who don't have differences, that shift takes place. You spend their childhood trying to help them to change and trying to push them to be their very best selves. And then they get to adulthood, and you mostly have an adult interaction with them in which it's clear to you what's changeable and what's not changeable, and you have some kind of acceptance of it. And in order to have a functional relationship, I mean, you continue frequently, many families, to be critical of this or that, or to argue about this or that, but essentially you have to get to a place where you're no longer doing that in the same way that you were. I think in this case, there was the difficulty, which is very profound for a lot of the families I'm looking at, of being unable to tell how well their child was capable of doing. So we all have some degree of that, you know, is my child actually going to be able to be a great musician, or is he just going to sing in the shower a lot? It's hard to know when the child is 2.5 years old and seems to like humming a tune. But at another level, you sort of know what's realistic for your child. With many diagnoses, you get a prognosis, and you know, okay, if my child has this condition, this is what he'll be able to do. But in recent years, we've discovered a lot of those prognoses are wrong. I mean, children with Down syndrome, for example, were presumed to be incapable of functioning. And I talked about how much better they functioned in the last 40 years than they did prior to that. And that's because new educational strategies were introduced and parents could do new things. But there was one mother who I interviewed for the book who had been one of the leaders in that early movement in the 1970s, Emily Kingsley. And she said, I was so amazed, and he could do so much more than anyone with Down syndrome had ever been able to do before, that I made the mistake of thinking that if I just did everything right, he could do anything. And actually, he has Down syndrome, and there are lots of things he can't do. And I had to discover them, and he had to discover them, and we were both heartbroken as we came up against them. And so I think that feeling of not knowing is very difficult. And I think with a child like Chris, I mean, he functions unbelievably much better than he did when I first met him 10 years ago. It's incredible how much progress he's made. He's very fluent on the computer and goes online and buys videos and things and can sort of type things, even though he can't express himself verbally in language. He doesn't use language much for personal communication, but he can type things out and do things. It's stupefying to see. He's actually not a bad artist. He did a lovely drawing that he gave to me about 6 months ago that I have hanging up at home. I mean, he's got a lot going for him that one wouldn't have imagined possible. But I think when he was growing up, his mother believed that she could bring about a complete revolution, and his father thought, if she wants to try it, she can try it, and that they got an easier life when they got to the point of thinking he can do an awful lot, but we now know more or less what he can do and what he can't.
So parenthood has these both phases of acceptance, of just loving what the child is and loving what you are yourself, and this attempt to change and to improve and to get the best out of it. And these seem to be both parts of what parenthood is about.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
It is also, I think that transpires from the video, but also from the story in your book. There's also here, I think, quite noticeable, well, first of all, the love between the two. But also the transforming force of this love, because the father has also gone. The father you see interviewed here has also had to go to a whole process of transformation, of accepting this. And what I find remarkable here is the fact again of love being the force to be able to accept, but also to face this challenge of this child. And you almost have the impression it's not all the efforts the parents have put into Chris, but it's just the love. And is there anything like that in the other stories as well, or is this typical for this story?
Well, I think you alluded earlier to the fact that the subtitle in the British edition was A Dozen Kinds of Love.
Yes.
And I think that it's very much a book about love and about the transformative power of love. I don't think love by itself will give somebody who's got all of these special needs a wonderful life. I think the love has to be borne out in seeking supports and seeking treatment and helping them to develop in a human way and so on and so forth. But I think you would never have the energy or the patience to do this if you didn't feel a great deal of love. And Chris's mother actually was really quite a remarkable woman. She didn't have much of an education, neither did he, and she figured out what he needed and set up, as it says, the school program. They had interns coming from really fine American universities. This was someone, I don't think she'd ever even finished high school. I mean, she was someone who really didn't have any of that, but she so loved her son that she determined that she was going to learn everything there was to learn about this condition. And one of the manifestations of her love, I mean, she loved him and she gave him hugs too. One of the manifestations of her love was that she did all of this. And she died tragically of cancer. I actually met her 10 days before she died. And when she was dying of cancer, she said, I feel so sad to be leaving Chris, and they have a daughter as well who does not have autism. She said, I'm so sad to be leaving the children behind, but I've served the purpose I had to serve in Chris's life. And Chris, who, as you saw, can sort of be biting and can be difficult, was curled up on the bed next to her. I mean, you could feel the sort of depth of that love, and you could feel that he had gotten better, partly because she had introduced these educational strategies, and partly because no matter how difficult he was, no matter how much of a mess he was making, no matter how he was, I don't know, smearing feces on the wall as some autistic people do, I mean, a lot of difficult stuff, she had been so unflagging in that affection. And that, I think, is transformative.
Now, there is this transformative love in, let's say, in humankind, thanks to, in a way, thanks to this kind of condition, Down syndrome. Now, imagine that at some point we will be able definitively, by means of pre-birth diagnosis, to establish that this is going to happen, and we can actually decide it's not going to happen, so these children will not be born anymore. Are we lacking anything? And
I think that when we lose on the full range of human diversity, that there is a loss. And I think when we're able to prevent people from having to suffer, that that is a gain, and that we're constantly having to measure the loss and the gain against each other. I mean, I've met people who are in the Down syndrome world, people who have children with Down syndrome, some of the people who actually have Down syndrome, who find it a very rewarding life. And I've met people you know, a lot of families who've said, I wouldn't want to change my child, that line that I had in other contexts in the talk. There's no question, however, that life is difficult for people with Down syndrome, and they don't live as long as the general population. They have an incredibly high rate of Alzheimer's. They require all kinds of supports and care. There are all kinds of issues associated with Down syndrome. I think we should be awake to the fact that we're constantly losing things. You know, we've lost the native cultures of many countries that were colonized. We've lost many languages that used to be spoken and that are no longer spoken. If we're going to lose some of these identities, we should think it through and we should notice it. And we should try to make those decisions clearly. There are people who will always feel that these lives are well worth living and who will be horrified by people choosing not to have these children. I think the decision about what kind of child to have rests squarely with the mother and father. I would love for the mother and father to feel that they understand what it is they're looking at when they're at the early stages of it, because often they don't. And one of my purposes in this book was not to say more people should have children with Down syndrome, because I don't think they should, but to say people who are deciding whether or not to terminate a pregnancy should know what life is like for a child with Down syndrome and for a parent who has a child with Down syndrome, and they should be as well informed as possible before they make the decision. And I've had letters from people who've written and said, I read your book and it helped me decide to terminate my pregnancy. And I've had letters from people who've said, I read your book and it helped me decide not to terminate the pregnancy. And I thought, okay, then I've done what I set out to do. I haven't sort of made people feel they can't tell me about one side or the other.
Was this really, sorry, yeah.
No, and probably there may be not one perspective from which you can decide those questions.
Right.
It may be that even mankind shouldn't try to answer those questions, but people should do it by themselves.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Is that really one of the goals that were there when you set out writing this book? Was it indeed for, let's say, prospective parents and parents who of, let's say, different children, or parents that could have different children? Was that really one of the
I wasn't thinking so much about the sort of selective abortion question, though it became clear to me that that was a central question as I went along. What I was hoping, I think, to accomplish when I set out to write the book was to indicate that that it is possible to have a child who is very different and to find a lot of meaning in the experience. I mean, I've said in the book that a lot of these parents ended up grateful for lives they would have done anything to avoid. And I wanted to indicate to people that that shift could take place, and that when you discover that your child is different in some way, your existing actual child who's there, that there is a lot of possibility for finding great joy and love in the experience.
And will this, so you just said that one of the nerves of the parents of Chris were that they didn't know how much he could improve, or how much they could change, how much they could transform. And you may perhaps understand that those parents will wish to have the knowledge of how far, and exactly that kind of knowledge. And it seems that one of the messages of the book is that you can't have this in general, and that you should find this out with each child again for each set of parents. And so there's no general solution or general answer to this kind of ignorance.
I think it's surprising how little we really know of what children will be able to do. I have dyslexia, and it was quite pronounced when I was little, and my mother worked very hard with me on helping me to be able to read and write despite it, and was very devoted to that cause, and brought about an enormous change. When I was applying to schools, when I was the age that my son is now, all of the schools told my mother that I was never going to learn to read or write. And I've had a lot of problems in life, and that's not one of them.
Oh, really? Yes.
So I just think that there is a sense that people are constantly saying, this is what your child can do, this is what your child can't do, even in a case such as mine, and they're frequently wrong. I think in some ways, however, and I wrote about this in the book, the fact that my mother did such a good job of helping me to compensate for my dyslexia, and I still have dysgraphia, I write letters out of order and backwards and so on, but I compensated for it in quite adequately. But I think it sort of set the stage for thinking, well, maybe we can just resolve the gay thing this way too. And that proved less amenable to interference. So
no solution there.
Yeah.
No. Okay, maybe time to watch the final video.
I really didn't even know that something was going on, that there was something wrong in my mind. I didn't know that. I just knew that I was in pain. On a physical level, it was like my brain, I could feel the back of my neck, popping and sizzling, like my head was just heating up. Objects became animate, things became threatening. I became very, very scared and frightened. And so the delusions were ones where I actually felt that I was a surgeon, and that was one. And I felt I had to literally extricate the demon from inside of my body. And I would do that by cutting and burning myself. I didn't bathe or shower for months at a time. I was scratching my body. I had inflicted wounds and sores on my face and in my scalp and in my arms. I had no idea what was happening. And my life was just shattering, and I felt like I was dying. My mother, even though she had absolutely no understanding of what was going on with me, in fact, I was very frightened by her. I was frightened by her lipstick, by her nail polish, and thought she was a witch. I remember when we had a huge disagreement because I wore black socks. And to her, black socks were like, what woman wears black socks? What daughter of mine wears black socks? There's something obviously wrong with you. I ended up being picked up by my mother in her car, and she drove me to a hospital in Westchester County, New York, called Four Winds Hospital. When I first met Sam, who was to become my doctor, I was mute. I was apparently curled up on the floor in the corner of his office. And so he looked at me and he said, "You have paranoid schizophrenia." And the second word out of his mouth, the second sentence out of his mouth was, "And you can recover." The relief that came over my face when I heard that there was a name to what was going on with me. No one had ever told me what was wrong with me, what was happening to me. That was the beginning of my turning point, my choosing life. I don't think of myself as a schizophrenic. I am Susan. I am an artist. I have brown hair. I have brown eyes. I'm Susan. There are always issues and difficulties in human relationships between mother and child, and my mother and myself. But today we both wear black socks.
Amazing, yeah?
Yeah. It's beautiful.
This is amazing.
She says there was a moment that she accepted to start to live, or a phrase like that, and it was when her doctor, Sam, gave her a name to talk about what was going on. And then she could somehow accept it, and possibly a role was played by that he said she could recover from it. And perhaps just accepting it was part of the recovery. I was wondering about that. And in the first chapter of your book, you cite a prayer that I was thinking about when I started reading the book, the Serenity Prayer, which says, "Give me the courage and the strength to change what can be changed, and give me the serenity to accept what cannot be changed." And then the final bit is the best, I think. Give me the wisdom to be able to discern between the two.
Yes.
And I'm a bit concerned with science today, but this is part of what my job is about. And I was wondering whether contemporary modern science can play the role of wisdom well here. Because part of what science seems to think is that acceptance is never going to happen. Whenever we find something, we will try to find a cure and not accept. And there may be a trick in what Sam told her, that she could recover and that therefore she started to accept. I'm just curious because your book is not a scientific book, but it's a very wise book with a lot of wisdom about the difference between and the way in which to discern between what we can change, what we cannot change. Would you think that people who trust science for this, or who would replace your book with the scientific research, would do better in terms of wisdom? I'm sorry for this question. But
it's not a question.
Manage that without sounding like a ranking test. I think that there has been a tendency for identity politics to suggest that it's all about acceptance, and for the hard sciences to accept that it's all about fixing the problem, and that often the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The wisdom to know the difference, I think, is the most elusive and most difficult thing. And I think about it all the time at both profound levels and trivial levels. I mean, on the one hand, if you're it was an extraordinary thing for Sam Klagsbrun to say to his patient, you have paranoid schizophrenia and you can recover, because many people with paranoid schizophrenia actually can't recover. Many of them are unresponsive to medications and to other interventions, and it's a life sentence for them. And I think that he gave her that confidence, and she has emerged in quite an extraordinary way. And her narrative of that emergence is quite remarkable. She said to me when we first spoke, she said, I remember the first time I felt love after all that. I don't even remember who it was, probably Sam, she said, but it felt to me not like something big and dramatic, just like when I was a little girl and I would go fishing and catch a sunfish, just that little tug at the end of the line. And as my heart expanded, I mean, as the psychosis receded, it left room for my heart to grow. That was such an exquisite way of positioning it. But I think that the emergence that she had to do partly with Sam Klagsbrun, who was very loving toward her. I mean, not inappropriately loving toward her, but he was not simply providing her with medication and going through formulaic therapies. She was at this hospital. She described how one day she was at the hospital where she was in residence, and she had gone out in the pouring rain and was just lying in the middle of the road in the pouring rain, and Sam came out and picked her up and carried her inside. She described a lot of that kind of response and attention. And her mother said, I didn't think that she was going to get better. But Sam did think she was going to get better, and he was the sort of scientist and the doctor, and her mother was the one who was in a kind of denial and trying to block it all out and trying just to focus on her socks and so on. I mean, it was an extraordinary dynamic.
But it is curious. I mean, as you mentioned, she says in the book, but also in this video, it's the label itself that already did the trick, so to speak. The fact that there was a name for her condition.
Yes.
And it's not only the second sentence you can cure from it was also the first sentence. Yeah, you have paranoid schizophrenia. What is this? How do you explain this? This fact that you are recognized, that your condition is being recognized, and that there's a name for it seems to be very important. It's not just you can be cured from it, but it's also the first sentence, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Many of the conditions described in the book instigate in the people who are affected by them an immense sense of isolation and loneliness, and they think no one else has ever felt this. I mean, I discovered that a lot when I was working on my book about depression, that many people get depressed and they don't think anyone else has ever gone through quite what they are going through. And then they meet other people who have dealt with depression, or they meet doctors who are able to say to them, oh, this is very characteristic, and this is how it usually plays out, and this is how long it's likely to last, and these are some of the treatments, and the astonishment of thinking, oh, it's not just me, it's a human phenomenon is enormous. Many of the people I interviewed, when they discovered their children had rare or unusual conditions, the first thing they did now, which they couldn't do 30 years ago, but now they can, is to go on the internet and find other people who have the same condition. And to some extent, with diagnosis comes prognosis. So if you know what you have, then you often know what can be done about it, how many people recover, how much they recover, how so on and so forth. One of the things that's in the chapter on children with multiple severe disabilities that can be very difficult is when you have a child and you don't actually have a specific diagnosis and you therefore don't know what's likely or what's not likely or what can get better or what can't get better. Because mostly if you say to someone, you have this condition, these are the treatments, and this is how much better you're likely to get, the person will go ahead and try the treatments and will strive to get to that point of betterness. When you don't have any idea what's wrong with you, you don't know what treatments there are, and you also don't know whether it can ever resolve or whether you can ever get any better. That's a much more frightening situation. Many people described, they said, when I got the diagnosis, it was a bad diagnosis, but at least I knew what I was dealing with. That helps people a lot.
So recovery need not mean the same as repair, but you can recover by acknowledging that there is some track that you are on, which has some end, which you may call repair or whatever, but where you can reconcile yourself with the condition you are in.
Right.
And it seems, well,
you can find community too through that condition. You find community too. You have other people who are in the same condition, and you can talk to them, and you can feel, oh, they know what I'm talking about. They've been through this as well. So
and that may, the distinction between the vertical and the horizontal identity may play a role there, because when you don't know that there are others on the same track as you, it's very difficult to understand what recovery means.
And I should indicate that there's also a horizontal community of parents, not only the horizontal community of people who are affected, but you discover your child has kinese dysplasia, and you go online and you find a lot of other people who have children with kinese dysplasia, and you all talk to each other, and you suddenly have a community that you would never have conceptualized before.
Let's bring the audience in for questions. There are very charming assistants with microphones. Raise your hand, speak into the microphone directly, and be short with your question, please. Any question? Yeah, the back.
Hello, Mr. Solomon. Thank you very much. I'd like to talk a bit further on parents who have to deal with a child who turned out to be a criminal, and about their acceptance of that child. Isn't that the most difficult part in your story? I didn't read your book, I saw the films on the internet and so on.
So the issue of parents dealing with children who are criminals is difficult for two reasons. One of them is that, of course, the parents have to live with the knowledge of the destruction their children have caused to other people, and there's a lot of sadness attached to that, as opposed to just having a child who suffers himself, or a child who's instigated suffering in others. But I think we have a grave injustice in the way that we conceptualize crime. We used to think that people were gay because they had overbearing fathers and passive mothers. We used to think people had autism because they had refrigerator mothers. We used to think people had schizophrenia because their parents nurtured an unconscious wish that their child not exist. If you go back a few hundred years to the theory of imaginationism, we believed that children were born with dwarfism or deformity as an expression of the mother's lascivious tendencies. We've finally given up on all of those things, but we still blame parents when their children are criminals. Now, the reason we do that is that children who are subjected to extreme abuse or neglect may, in fact, have that abuse or neglect as triggering factors in their criminality. But there are many, many people who commit crimes who come from solid, stable, loving homes and who simply have that tendency toward criminality, which exists in them in some ways more like an illness than some of the illnesses I was investigating. And I think there's a great cruelty which is visited on parents of making them feel that they are bad people because their child has done a bad thing, and that our inability to separate that out and say, wonderful parents, they have this tragic thing, in the same way that we say wonderful parents with a tragic thing when the child is blind, or when the child has any of these other differences. I think our tendency to blame parents is misguided and cruel and very, very destructive. But I think it does make those lives extremely difficult. There are not a lot of great support groups. You go online and you type in, "my child is a murderer," you don't immediately get a whole community in the way that you do for other conditions.
Yeah. Any further questions? The other, so, yeah.
Thank you for your speaking interesting way. I have a question. If you have experienced difference in acceptance from parents with children who have physical disabilities or children who have psychiatric disabilities. I have worked with adults with neurological problems, neurological disabilities, and finally the most difficult to accept is not the wheelchair, for example, but the changes in character or the psychiatric problems. I wonder if you have experienced difference in the process of acceptance.
Well, the book is, of course, much broader than the lecture or than the online videos. And so I've looked at quite a broad range of experiences. And I think I should emphasize that these videos were made mostly with people who were articulate and able to express themselves, because those are the people who go on video. But there were not all the stories in the book are happy stories. And I don't mean to suggest, oh, all of these people have all these identities and they just all have a wonderful time. So I think I should make that very clear. I looked at people with extreme physical disabilities, the people in the multiple severe disabilities chapter, and I looked at the sort of toxic effect of those. The chapter on schizophrenia, in which Susan appears, is the chapter in which I dealt most specifically with mental illness, though autism also has, aspects of how it's categorized is complicated, but it has aspects anyway of psychological or personality challenges. And I found that those were in many ways very, very difficult things to deal with. Within autism, there are people like Jim Sinclair, whom I quoted in my talk, who talk about how autism is actually just a different and valid way of being. And I met people who said, I'm glad I have autism. Those were obviously people who could talk and whose autism was at a level at which they could conceptualize their own condition, but who said that they felt it was their identity, it was the way they thought, it had allowed them in some instances to be very innovative in the area of technology, for example. They had a lot of value in it. I didn't meet anyone who had schizophrenia who said, I'm so glad I have schizophrenia. I met some people who have schizophrenia who were leading incredibly good, rich lives despite it, and who had found very good ways of dealing with it, but I didn't meet anyone who said, oh, I'm absolutely thrilled that I have this condition. It's very, very difficult. And I think in some ways schizophrenia is the most difficult for parents because of its late age of onset. So if you have a child with autism and you keep saying, I wish my child didn't have autism and I want to imagine my child without autism, what you're doing is imagining someone you've never met and who doesn't exist. But if you have a child with schizophrenia and you say, I want to imagine my child without schizophrenia, you're imagining the person you knew for possibly 17 or 20 or 24 years before the illness kicked in. And therefore, you have a very vivid sense of who that person is without the schizophrenia. And parents often have the idea that the schizophrenia is like a bacteria, that it's invasive, and that you could just get it to go away again. And actually, schizophrenia works not necessarily by having something added on top of someone's personality, but by destroying other underlying parts of one's personality. I mean, there are positive and negative developments in schizophrenia. And often it's very difficult for the parents to understand, we can't just take the schizophrenia away and give you back the person you had. And those mental illnesses are incredibly, incredibly difficult. Some people find their way through, but it's certainly not easy.
Thank you. Any further? Yeah, front.
I was wondering what you think should happen with our society, what should change, that we accept this diversity you talk about, that we accept this and don't try to fix everything.
Well, that's an enormous and very broad question. I think part of it has to do with raising people's consciousness of these kinds of difference. I think a lot of it has to do with these things becoming more visible. I think a lot of it has to do with our making a commitment as a society and saying we will put in wheelchair access ramps because we are not going to build a world that is only for the majority. We're going to try to construct a built environment that embraces and accepts people who have got differences or challenges of some kind. I think that the progress that has been made and that my book really chronicles has been very reliant on the internet, because I think the sense that people can find community and that people are able to get information about their child's condition has made an enormous, enormous difference, and the existence of those communities online is huge. But I also think that there's a kind of imperative toward activism. I mean, not everyone is prepared to be activists. Not everyone wants to go and put themselves on the line and talk about things. But I always think of what the American gay activist Harvey Milk was murdered in San Francisco in the 1970s. A young man said to him, "What can I do to help the movement?" And he said, "Go out and tell someone." And I think people, by going out and having their lives visible, by making the effort to put their lives into the public eye, transform public opinion. Emily Pearl Kingsley, whom I mentioned earlier, who has a son with Down syndrome, when he was born said, "The day after he was born, I turned on the television and suddenly there was no one who looked like me." And she was a writer for Sesame Street, and she said, "I want my son on television on Sesame Street so that people can see this." And I can't tell you how many people I met who had children in the 80s who said, "But at least we'd seen Jason Kingsley on Sesame Street. At least we knew there were other people dealing with this." And I think, therefore, that publicness, while it's not something I would oblige people to do if they feel unable to do it, I think is transformative. And then for the rest of us to have the eyes to watch and see and the ears to hear.
And it seems to work. I mean, your book is a bestseller, and I think I have a question also about my reading experience of the book, and I think I'm probably not alone in this book. You are moved, and there are many of the questions. I must say that there are many of the interviews that you've held, and which you, if you read them, there are tears in your eyes. You have to cry. You are moved.
Thank you.
Probably this is because you're a very good writer. But apart from that, there is something to these stories that indeed moves us. Now, not all of us, probably a majority of us, don't have children that have the conditions that you describe. Most of us, probably all of us, don't want to have children that have these conditions. So what is it you think that moves people and that gives your book the acclaim that it has? Indeed, apart from the fact that it's very well written, it's in the substance of the book as well. What is it you think? What explains this?
I think that these are moving stories, and I think they're moving because they are about people doing the very thing we were talking about. It's about how people forge meaning and build identity under circumstances of apparent adversity. And I think the ability of people to cope with difficulty, it's why we all like novels set in wartime and so on. The ability of people who are faced with difficulties to deal with them is enormous. I sometimes say that many of the people I was writing about developed a kind of heroism, and that if you banish the dragons, you banish the heroes, and we get attached to the heroic strain in our own lives. And people really want to have that experience over and over again of triumphing over adversity. It gives us all hope, and I think we admire them. I admire them. I mean, I carefully chose to write about people I admire. Some I admire more, some I admire less. Some of them are people who are very flawed, and I tried to write honestly about what their flaws were. But essentially, I wrote because I thought it's rather awe-inspiring that all of these people were able to rise so well to the occasion.
Any question here?
Hello, thank you. Thanks for your incredible investigation. Thank you so much for that. Your book is about loving and accepting your children. Did you see any proof or any difference with parents who were more capable of accepting themselves and the results which gave that at the children?
I think parents who are better at self-acceptance are likely to be better at accepting their children. I think parents have to go through a process of determining how they relate to two phenomena. One is, I have a child with a disability, and the other is, I am now the parent of a child with a disability. How much is it the child story, and how much is it the parent story? How much is the parent saying, but I don't want to be identified with other parents who are dealing with disability. I want to be one of the people whose life is perfect. And how much are the parents saying, I am whoever I am, but I want to help my child as much as possible to do as well as he can possibly do. There are definitely some parents who are better equipped to deal with children who are different than others. And I don't believe in a system that says all of these parents have to keep their children, have to celebrate them. There are some parents for whom giving their children up to care is the appropriate decision. And there's one in particular who I wrote about at some length in the book, who had a child with multiple very severe disabilities and decided she couldn't cope with that child and left her at a hospital and said, I can't take her home. I'm not going to take her home, when the child was about 8 months old and had been in and out of the hospital a number of times. She said, I'm not the right mother for this child. And I thought that was a decision that required a great deal of courage on her part. I think it also takes a lot of courage to continue to take care of a child who is as demanding as Imogen, the child in this particular case, proved to be. But I think that I think different parents are equipped to do different things, and I think it's unjust, and it would never be what I wanted to do in this book by holding up examples of how people have coped to say everyone should be able to do the same thing. No, I've said this is how some people coped, and it may help you figure out how to do some of the same thing, but there also has to be freedom and leeway for you to say, this is more than I can handle. And when that freedom and leeway are denied, I think the results can be catastrophic.
Mm-hmm. That's very clear. Any further here?
Thank you so much for your beautiful words, and I didn't have the time to read it already, but I'm looking forward to read it.
Thank you.
Well, I have a more personal question. I hope you will consider to answer that, but I was so curious in what way it affects your parenthood yourself, because you had 10 years of investigation and interviews with parents, and now you're a parent yourself. So I was wondering what is the effect on your fatherhood or parenthood?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to answer the question insofar as I can. I think it had a very profound effect on my fatherhood. I think in part because I've done a better job than I otherwise would have of recognizing my children as separate people and not insisting that they are somehow an extension of myself, or that their role in life is to, fulfill my dreams and realize my ambitions. I hope I would have been too generous to act in that way anyway, but having written this book, I feel like I have a very clear sense of, okay, the children are different from and separate from me, and I have to recognize them as such. And I also have been much more awake to this question that I alluded to earlier of having to think all the time, okay, Blaine, my daughter, just did something that I thought was rude. Am I going to interfere and say, you may not do that and you must act differently? Or am I going to accept it? And then saying, Blaine has just discovered that she has a lazy eye, and she has a bandage over her eye for a couple of hours every day, and how am I going to talk to her about that sense of being different and the fact that the bandage is uncomfortable, and what are the ways in which I have to help her to get better, and what are the ways in which I have to help her to have a good self-image and to feel wonderful about herself. The same with the other children. How am I going to balance those things? And I don't think I would have conceptualized it that way before I worked on the book. But having worked on the book, I've seen, it can be really dangerous not to fix something that's fixable and to leave someone suffering unnecessarily and unable to function. And it can be really dangerous to spend too much energy trying to fix something that isn't fixable and making someone feel bad about him or herself. I just think I'm more awake to all of those nuances than I would have been.
Thank you. Wonderful.
But you can ask my children in about 10 years.
We'll wait for their books. Yeah. A final question, brief one, a brief answer, I'm afraid.
Thanks for the great book. I was wondering, have you heard back from any of the people you interviewed, and did, I guess some of them at least must have read the book, did reading about themselves or about their children or their parenthood change their ideas about their parenting or identity?
I've heard back from a huge number of the people in the book, and as always happens, there were people I was worried about, all of whom have been delighted by the way they were portrayed, and there was one family about whom I thought I'd written in the most admiring and loving way, who had complete hysterics and threatened a lawsuit. So actually two families, there have been two families who did that. We've resolved and settled the matter. But the question of which is, of how people have responded, most of them have been gratified to see their stories told. And when I was doing the interviews with people, I said over and over again to people, you're telling me this story which is clearly so painful for you to recount, and I wonder why you're doing it. And they said, if I felt very alone in these experiences, and if telling my story will help someone else to feel less alone, then I'm game and willing to do it. And a lot of them have written to me since and have said, I feel like the story is out there and I believe it will help other people, and I feel very pleased that you've done that. I've also now had a lot of invitations. I was the keynote speaker at the Little People of America, the Dwarfism conference that I described going to 10 years ago with the sense that I didn't know what I was doing. I was the sort of inaugural speaker for Gallaudet, the Deaf University in America, for their sesquicentennial celebration. I've had a lot of these invitations from the groups around these conditions, and that's been very gratifying because I thought, okay, I can tell the deaf story to hearing people, but will it resonate with deaf people? I can tell the dwarf story to average height people, but will it resonate with dwarfs? And I feel that it by and large has. But of course, I also get, occasional hostile letters from people, but not mostly from the people in the book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, very, very many thanks to Andrew for being here, for sharing his wisdom indeed for us, for the book. Andrew will stay a couple of minutes. You can buy the book at the exit and have it signed by him, but be quick. He won't be there for hours. So many thanks to Andrew, first of all. Many thanks to Jan Brandse for his comments. Thank you. And many thanks to you for being such an attentive audience, for asking the wonderful questions you did. On behalf of Soeterbeeck, the Centrum voor Ethiek, and Nieuw Amsterdam, the publishing house, the Dutch publisher of Andrew's book, I wish you, I again thank you. And I wish you all the best, and see you back again probably with Soeterbeeck on the Soeterbeeck event. Thank you very much.